Down here at home, we're entering the craziest part of the whole fall. The rut's kicking in, duck season is in full swing. What you end up with is a whole lot of early mornings, long days, and late nights. It can be taxing, to say the least. You get tired, plain and simple. I'll tell you what, though, that's why I'm excited that Primos Hunting has teamed up with Pursuit Energy to bring you great tasting, all-day energy for those all-day hunts. The Call of the Wild in a can, produced right here in the good old US of A. Available in 2 high-caliber and zero-sugar flavors, Original Gobbler and Blazing Orange. There is limited production quantity, so order your energy drinks while supplies last. You can get them at buypursuitnow.com/collections/Primos Hunting. Also, did you know you could win a brand new Polaris XP1000 North Star Edition just by being an Onyx Hunt Elite member? Yeah, you heard me correctly. All you have to do is have an active Onyx Hunt Elite account by January the 7th, 2024, and you'll be automatically entered to win one of 2 brand new Polaris Rangers that we're giving away. And those are North Star editions. That's creme de la creme, top of the line. It's got all the bells and whistles, backup camera, climate control, fully cabbed in, a winch. If you think about it, it's got it. So if you're an Onyx Hunt Elite member already, thank you. We greatly appreciate it, and we want to show that we appreciate it. If you're not an Onyx Hunt Elite member, what I always tell people is there's 1,000,002 reasons to become one, and now we're going to give you another reason. It's going to give you a shot at winning a brand new Polaris. So become an Onyx Hunt Elite member today. Enjoy the show. Welcome to the Speak the Language podcast presented by Onyx Hunt. My friends, we are on the final piece of this Quail in the Southeast series. This is it, the last piece of the puzzle, crossing of the finish line, the light at the end of the bobwhite tunnel, and I sincerely hope that you've enjoyed this as much as I have. Quite frankly, this is the most time and energy I've ever put into one topic, but it has been completely worth it. So, let's end strong, shall we? Last week, we focused heavily on learning why, or the many whys, I should probably say, that caused us to lose our quail populations. We heard from legitimate subject experts, Dr. Mark Mcconnell and Quail Forever biologist John Mark Curtis. They taught us more about quail habitat needs, the changes in our current landscape that gave us all a better understanding as to why quail simply cannot exist here like they did in the past, the way things are currently. This week is all about the present and the future. I think both are important to think about. We'll hear from more subject experts to explain those to us and let us know how much, if any, real hope there is for us to ever have a healthy population of quail again. And maybe, just maybe, we'll hear just a little bit more from our dear friend Jimmy Bryan. Kicking us off is Dr. James Martin. Dr. Martin is a wildlife professor at UGA and was simply described to me by many as the guy when it comes to quail and quail research. I believe the most common sentiment was, if you're going to talk about quail, you got to talk to James Martin. So obviously, I obliged. We start the conversation with a personal story from Dr. Martin as to how he became so interested and invested in quail.
So my grandfather was a bird hunter. My Uncle Buck was a bird hunter. The guy, I worked on a tobacco farm for 12 to 15 years. I don't remember now. And the guy that I worked for, his father was a bird hunter. And another guy I knew was a bird hunter. And they were, this was the 80s. And so quail in North Carolina were pretty much the point where you would go out and not find any. And so they were, most of those guys I mentioned were on their last bird dog. My grandfather, when that dog he had when I was young, it died. He didn't get another one. When my Uncle Buck's dog died, he didn't get another one.
That sounds like the title of a sad country song.
It was.
On the last bird dog.
Yeah, hunting the last bird dog. But they would tell stories, and so I grew up listening to the stories, and I liked the stories, and I obviously respected those men tremendously. Mm-hmm. So it was like, well, if these dudes are the pillars of my life, they're the major influences in what I think is right in the world, and they did it. It can't be wrong. So there was that seed that was planted.
Yeah.
And then there were some bobwhites around. And so when I would bump into the cubbies on my little Suzuki 125 four-wheeler rambling around clear cut, I was fascinated by them. So there was the natural ecological wildlife inquisitiveness that was like, man, these things they're cool. They're like little ghosts. You know, you see them every once in a while and they flush and they scare you, but then you might not see them for 6 months. And so there was that. And then as I got older, I've become more interested in science. And then somebody said, well, you can go major in being a wildlife biologist and make a living. And I was like, what? Because before I was always thought, well, this would just be a hobby. And so it was kind of my natural tendency to be scientifically minded, but also the cultural seed was there for doing something or trying to preserve a heritage that these dudes that I really respected grew up doing and did until they were in their 80s, many of them. So I got my first bird dog when I was 19 or 20 in college. And that just increased the connection between the bird, and then in college, one of my professors like, well, you should go to Georgia and see if you can study quail and for grad school. And so it just one thing led to another, but it was that foundation of just being around folks that talked about, my grandfather talking about, we used to go down to Pittsburgh and hunt around cotton fields, and we used to find 20 cubbies and, things like that. And so that's kind of my journey, and it's consumed my daily life ever since.
Where are quail today in the present, specifically in the Southeast, Texas, Mississippi, Georgia, all that? Where are things at right now, and what does the future look like?
So where are things now? Just thinking about east of the Mississippi River and say south of Tennessee and south, if you want to narrow it down to that geography.
Sure. Yeah.
So we have a couple strongholds within that region. You have what's called the Red Hills region of North Florida, South Georgia, which are privately owned estates that are intentionally managed for bobwhites pretty much for the sole purpose of hunting. And there's probably 400 to 500,000 acres of land that would be attributed to that area. And then there's a similar area around Albany, Georgia, not quite as big as the traditional Red Hills area, but intensively managed, and they have a lot of bobwhites. And then you have scattered throughout the whole Southeast single landowner properties that are anywhere from 500 to 5,000 acres or so that are intensively managed for bobwhites, and that quail are doing well. And then you have 1 to 2 wildlife management areas and maybe a Forest Service land per state where we have quail populations that are considered, quote, huntable. Mm. And then we have all the other 98% of the land base where we have very low densities, probably 1 bird per 25 acres to 1 bird per 100 acres, where they're just holding on. And according to breeding bird survey data, they're declining anywhere from 3 to 5% per year, and they have been since 1966. So we really have this really interesting bimodal, almost a paradoxical relationship where we have intensively managed properties where quail are doing really well, and in some cases increasing. And then we have the rest of the range in the Southeast where they're declining 5% a year. What we see in those, even in those areas where populations are declining and there's not a lot of habitat left, where we do management, there's still enough bobwhites to positively respond to habitat restoration, which is important because if we ever get to the point where we put out so-called habitat and we don't get a response, then we're in a really bad situation. We're not quite there yet, at least according to our data, but at some point, if things continue to go like they are, we'll get to that point where we're almost past the point of no return without some major interventions.
Mm-hmm. So referring to those strongholds, what are some of the big factors? Like, there has to be some reason, like why I understand they're intensively managed now, but are they strongholds because they've always been intentionally managed, or was there just a lot of quail there and they were able to hang on because there were so many? What caused those strongholds?
There's nothing magical about them as far as like there's no soil differences. There's no ecological reasons why they're strongholds compared to some random spot in Mississippi or Georgia or South Carolina. They exist because of economic reasons and cultural reasons that, like in the case of Thomasville, Georgia, that was where the railroad ended. And so in the early 1900s, that's where the railroad ended, and wealthy people from the north basically want to get as far south as they could, and that just happened to be where the railroad stopped. If the railroad would have stopped in Greenville, South Carolina, we would have a stronghold in Greenville, South Carolina. So there's nothing ecologically per se magical about Thomasville, Georgia, compared to Greenville, South Carolina. It's just that's where the railroad ended.
Right.
So we could, if we took the same approach in Greenville, South Carolina, and I'm just picking up a random city, we could have just as many quail there as we do in Thomasville, with a rare exception. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. It just going through all these different topics of what we had, what was, what happened and what we have now. It blows my mind. I guess it's not a surprise, but it blows my mind just how much of this start to finish, like from the demise to intensively management that's positive affecting quail now. But it's like we as humans have so much influence on these birds, man. It's and I don't think, I know I don't realize it sometimes, but it's just crazy to me when you hear these stories. It's like we swing such a big stick and we don't realize it sometimes.
We're the major driving force, positive or negative. The agricultural policy, which is a human decision, how we've managed forest land over the last 50 years. We've, gone away from prescribed fire. That decision alone affected millions of acres. Get away from prescribed fire. You referenced Webster County, Mississippi. Lack of prescribed fire and different forest management practices, which was entirely human-based decisions, have led to population declines. Where we have bobwhites in the Midwest, states like Kansas, we still have birds in those regions because the land use decisions for growing crops and pasture are still somewhat conducive to bobwhites. If they were to make decisions that change the way they farm, then bobwhites are going to likely change as well. So it's entirely a human influence on the population trajectories, and many of these decisions are made at large spatial scales and not at the individual landowner scale.
Yeah. But
we also have to keep in mind that our reference, what we reference as historical conditions is arbitrary. So we tend to think in 50 to 100 year intervals. And so we're comparing current conditions to what it was like 50 years ago or 60 years ago. But what was it like 200 years ago? My guess is that quail populations peaked in the early to mid 1900s, meaning there were probably more bobwhites then than there would have been 500 years ago. So it's a shifting baseline, and we're not going back. We're not going back at all, because we what we have today is a product of economic and cultural decisions that are way beyond bobwhite management. Mm-hmm. So we're not going back to the heyday. We have to create a new heyday that we find socially and economically acceptable.
Mm-hmm. Another topic of discussion right now, especially around the springtime, is people are always talking about turkey populations. Mm-hmm. I just can't help but keep noticing there's things that are said and there's topics that are brought up. They seem so similar in how, even talking about, people talk about the heyday of turkeys being in the, 1980s or 90s, I think it was. And saying, I've heard the same sentiment there. It's like, we're not going back to that. This is the new normal. But there's a common thread there, it seems like.
Yeah, absolutely. To go back to the heyday of quail, we're all going to have to go back farming with a mule. and I don't think anybody's lining up to do that. So progress per se, in quotes, is led to the detriment of quail, but we've also been a beneficiary of that in all other parts of society. So you can't separate out the cultural and the societal changes and the changes that happen with bobwhites. I think what we can hope for is on our public lands and for landowners that want quail, how can we maximize their abundance on those areas? We don't have enough money to restore quail across the historic range. Mm-hmm. We just don't.
Is there, and I'm asking this out of my own selfish interest, I guess, do you see any possibility in the future, no matter like if there was, I don't know, on any scale of conservation work that could be done, like you were saying, on private landowners that want it, on WMAs that it would be possible? Do you think there could be a day where you could see a guy driving around in Mississippi that had a setter in his truck and people wouldn't be wondering what that guy was doing?
Just like uniformly across the Mississippi? No.
Okay.
No, I guess I hold on to that little bit of optimism, but I think, is there a county you might could pick out and do that for in 30 years from now or 50 years from now? Possibly. Mm-hmm. But the demands on natural resources for other reasons, for crop production, for timber production, for urbanization, are going to far outweigh our ability for quail management at large scales.
Gotcha.
We're swimming hard against a current that we can't move.
Right. So it's possible, but on a very micro scale.
Yes.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So let's think about this. Let's say you get $10 million to manage for quail, right? Mm-hmm. Sounds like a lot of money, and it is. Especially for us, individually, $10 million, a lot of money. Annual cost for quail management is, even on the cheap side, is probably $50 an acre. Just the burning alone is $30, just using ballpark numbers. So how many acres can you touch or affect with $10 million at that rate? We can do some quick math. So we got $10 million, 20,000 acres, something like that. Mm. That's only managing it 1 year.
That's a year. That's wow.
Where does the money come from? If it's not a byproduct of what's going on in the land use. So 50, 60 years ago, quail were a byproduct of the mainstream farming forestry engine. So it was costing my grandfather that had the setters in the truck, as you mentioned, it was costing them nothing to produce those birds. It was totally byproduct. Now you have to be intentional, and if you're intentional, it means you're having to spend money that you would not otherwise have. So just using a ballpark $50, and you got 10 million, you're going to affect 20,000 acres. Well, what's the percentage of Mississippi that's 20,000 acres in Mississippi is less than 1% of the total land. There's a lot of money in the farm bill dollars. There's millions and millions, and in fact billions. But when you spread that over across the entire country on a proportional basis, it's a really small amount. So that's why we have to be really focused and targeted on where we spend that money for quail, so that we can see a response.
Yeah, that does put it on a perspective. I mean, it's a complete pendulum swing to where, I mean, it's like our on a grand scale, our incentive hasn't changed. It was people farming, trying to make a living. We have quail, and now it's people farming and trying to make a living, and we don't have quail. So it's like we haven't changed. It's just it makes sense when you put it in that kind of perspective. I don't like it. I don't like hearing that, but
well, I don't like it either, but we are our beneficiary of that, right? I mean, how many? I eat meat. You probably eat meat. We're still making personal decisions that are incentivizing farmers and whatnot to make the decisions they are. So we are collectively contributing to the problem because we like the conveniences of living in 2023.
If you don't take away anything else from this podcast, take away this. Our actions and our decisions have consequences. Positive or negative, our influence on the land and the wildlife is greater than we realize. You can never just do one thing. That's an ecological principle. I would like to think that all this is something that I already realized, but honestly not fully. I didn't grasp the scale of it all. Listening to Dr. Martin talk and realize that according to him, our most optimal quail future, so to speak, is going to be at a very localized scale is eye-opening, to say the least. But I've said it before throughout this series, and I'll continue to say it, there is hope. Next, we're going to hear from Dr. Brad Kubechka from Tall Timbers Research Station. A lot throughout this podcast, you've heard of an area mentioned fairly frequently called the Red Hills, a historically and currently high-frequency area for quail. There's a reason for that, and Brad's going to explain why and a whole lot more.
I'll tell you a little story about the history of the Red Hills and Tall Timbers real quick, but it was after the Civil War when a lot of those fields had gone fallow, when some of those guys went to fight in the Civil War, that those fields went fallow and grew up in a lot of the weeds and grasses and shrubs, kind of like quail really liked. And so during Reconstruction, a lot of Northerners were coming down to the South and buying up land and stuff like that, and helping during those times. And they realized that the quail hunting was really good, and it reminded them of the bird hunting from the old world. And they started buying up all this land, and within just a couple of decades, they came to the South with this preservationist kind of approach, like, oh, we don't want to touch it. That was the mentality versus conservation, where you have to actively manage. And but within a couple of decades, really, the properties that weren't continuing to manage how they've always been managed, predominantly with fire, they started losing their birds. And they hired a fellow by the name of Herb Stoddard to do a project to understand what was really going on with their populations. And Stoddard recognized that fire, or really the absence of fire, was one of the main reasons for that loss of quail on a lot of these properties. So he started one of the first banding studies for really North American birds, and it's still ongoing today at Tall Timbers, probably the longest running banding study in North America for upland birds.
When was that, when that started?
He started in 1924. Wow. So, yep, that's when they started talking about it. And he published the bobwhite quail, its habits, preservation, and increase, real thick book, in 1931, based off those years of research. That was 2 years prior to Game Management by Leopold. And the two were contemporaries. They were good friends, and they shared a lot of ideas. Leopold had actually been to the Southeast and to some of those properties that Stoddard was working on. And so when we read that old school, those texts about Leopold and the axe cow, match plow, and all that stuff, I have to think that Quail and Stoddard's work kind of led the way and maybe influenced Leopold's way of thinking. But not to digress too much, he found that when he started this banding study where they weren't burning areas that had grown up into thick mid-stories and just brambles that you couldn't put a dog through, really, the birds weren't there. He wouldn't trap any birds, and where he did trap birds, it was where he was finding quail. And so it's kind of a novel association. We think of habitat selection studies nowadays. It was kind of that, but very primitive. And recognize that influence of fire at a time when really fire was really taboo. But those folks that started adopting those practices and that kind of adaptive management that Stoddard was doing, their birds came back and they were doing well. So yeah, that being said, we have these challenges of in the Southeast of losing our quail, but there's hope in that. You're right in that it was kind of around the 80s or 90s that we saw this huge profusion of pine plantation. And what I've noticed, because I've kind of worked in areas that is the conversion was to Bermuda grass or something else, that I would rather have had it planted in pine plantation, because quite frankly, once you thin out that pine plantation and put fire back into the system, that seed bank is still there. And once we start thinning and burning, we can create those conditions again for our birds. Quail. When I say birds, I'm always talking about quail. Sure. So we can create those conditions again relatively easy. It just takes a pointed plan saying, okay, we're going to start, and this is how we start, and go about that. Now, there's a lot of dogma out there too, that and one of the things that I always hear is build it and they will come. And that's great, but it's not very scientific, really, in that quail has a 50-acre home range, and on average, in poor habitat, it's usually a little larger. But the probability of an individual in a large landscape, just finding a patch that's restored, and then it's two sexes, and they have successful reproduction, and it grows a population, it's probably pretty rare. But it could be. So it just depends. Our expectations have to meet. Like, if we're going to do some management, we have to have appropriate expectations on whether we're going to see a population response right away. If there's birds still in that area, definitely we should see a response from that management. But some areas, like you're talking about, they've kind of lost their populations. And if we do the management, but they might not necessarily come back. And I think that's happened in some situations where people just throw their hands up in the air and they say, you know what, it doesn't work. And we almost develop this sense of ecological despair, like it's hopeless. Bringing quail back is hopeless, because you hear a lot of folks that may have tried and have failed. Mm-hmm. They got to have those realistic expectations. Or maybe we have the perfect scenario, but the quail were already gone, and maybe we need reintroduction or something like that. But I can guarantee it's not hopeless, because we have a lot of success stories that we don't always talk about a lot. There's a lot of failures out there too. But I think we need to sing those praises from a lot of those success stories, because it can happen and it can work. It just takes time and effort. In some areas, we can't go down anymore. So I'm optimistic that we would go up. There's I agree. It's a lot of work, but it becomes fun over time. And so one of the managers that we're working with right now, he was deathly scared of fire when we started, and they were contracting out some of their burning. And he was involved with that, and he watched and learned, and he was like, I can do that. And so he took some courses and got a little educated, and he started just on his little Bahia grass field, and he put just. Not that was going to help a whole bunch burning a Bahia grass field, but so he was comfortable. The fuels were short, just a few inches tall, and he started with that and was comfortable. And now he loves to burn. He absolutely loves to burn. And so while yeah, have a lot of work to get done. Burning is namely the thing that we're doing every year. It's our primary management tool. It almost becomes just as much of a hobby as it is a job for burning.
So a very good friend of mine has a property, and he started working with Marcus Lashley. Originally, I think his main focus was on turkeys, for what he was trying. Well, then somewhere down the road, he saw a covey of quail run across the road on his place. Now that dude gets so much joy and excitement from trying, because ever since then, he still tries to do stuff for turkeys too, but he is doing like focused efforts on quail on his place. And now, it may not sound like a lot, but I'm going from seeing no quail now, just riding around doing the work that he's normally doing. He'll see 3 or 4 coveys when he's walking to a deer stand. He'll flush a covey every now and then. And that's here. That's here at home. And to your point, like that, he loves it. That's a hobby to him. He sent me a picture just a few weeks ago. He stopped his truck and there was about 12 quail walking across, just crossing the road there. And I've seen it just in that guy. He loves doing it. Absolutely loves it.
Yeah. There's probably nothing more gratifying than to see the fruits of your labor, over time. Immediately after burning, you can see that your effect too. It's that instant gratification, but because you've done something, and then over time, just to be able to see the change in the populations as you're managing, I think that's probably my most rewarding part of my job, is to get to work with landowners. And one of the keys that we always start with is monitoring, to get their baseline and where they're starting at. And it's usually pretty low. And then over time, seeing how that population can grow. And that's extremely gratifying. And that's for landowners, they feel the same way. I feel the same way. And even if it's not quail, like we mentioned, person might have 50 acres and is really isolated. They might be managing 4 quail, and they can see the species that respond that maybe aren't quail themselves, whether it be turkey or monarchs or whatever. They can see that they're on the right track. They have these measures of success, and they know that they're inherently doing good. It's really cool.
How often do you get to work with landowners? Is that something you do commonly in your role?
Yep. Yeah. So I kind of do a little bit of it all. Research is part of our program, but of course, outreach is huge. So we work with a lot of landowners and try to develop management plans and provide technical guidance, give them the resources they need, put them in contact with the right folks if they're interested in cost share. We also have a big push right now in East Texas. One of the parts of my job, I work a lot with private landowners and research on private lands, but we have a lot of public lands in East Texas as well, most of which don't have quail or many turkeys, with the exception of a few properties and areas. But that's one push that we're trying to go after now, is to increase the number of birds that we have on public lands. So there's opportunities for everyone to get to understand, how cool of a sport this can be. And like you said, maybe one day we just drive down the road and there's a fellow with a bird dog, and it's like, what are they doing? If I saw someone like that in East Texas today, I'd guess that they were woodcock hunting or duck hunting, not quail hunting.
If you can, and I may be putting you on the spot a little bit here, from the standpoint of working with a landowner on their property, is there a particular story or instance that sticks out to you? And I'm not asking you to give the person's name or any of that away, but if there was a story that you could tell that was like, man, this one really sticks out as one that we were able to work on and really saw a cool outcome. Is there anything like that?
Yeah, well, one of the properties that we're working on now in East Texas, our main research area, has done amazing things and great things. And it started with that commitment to management and management success. We started collecting data there 3 years ago, and they had done some thinning and some burning already. This was back in 2018. They had already thinned down to about 60 basal area or something like that, maybe a little lower. But it was somewhat small scale, and we started monitoring both fall covey counts, spring cock call counts for quail. We tried trapping it. We never had any observations of quail out there, at least during those surveys. Every now and then we might see a pair or something like that, but we also knew the neighbor had been releasing some pen raised birds, so we didn't really know whether those were wild stock or not. But after a couple of years and or several years, I guess, of working with that landowner and then getting the habitat right, but a population response wasn't evident, as I mentioned earlier, maybe those birds kind of already reached some level to where we weren't going to see a population response. We're in East Texas, or at least like most of the Southeast, we kind of lost those quail populations already. We did the work. We said, you know what, this is now the ideal candidate for translocation or reintroduction because the habitat's good, it's ready to go, but we haven't seen a population response. So we reintroduced bobwhite to that area early this year in January and in March, and they've just absolutely done phenomenal. This is the first year of that, but we've done call counts and we hear a lot of birds. Our survival, every single one of these birds are radio marked. Survival and reproduction are just outstanding. So again, it's one of those things. I've been involved in a lot of reintroduction / translocation projects, and they don't always go that well. But this is definitely one of those instances where we took the time leading up to it several years to get the habitat right, because that's the foundation of all this is habitat. Whether we're talking about burning or thinning or whatever, it's a habitat first. And so we took the time to get it right and then moved into that. And that's been really gratifying so far. And that's a longer term study. We'll be doing that for another couple of years, but that's just not an isolated case study. We've seen that on other properties that we work with tall timbers in the Southeast, from Alabama to the Carolinas and the Mid-Atlantic area. It's very possible. It just takes that commitment to that management first.
So if you were to describe that property to me to the point where it's like the habitat is right, what does that mean? Like what did that place consist of that made you say this is good, this is right for quail?
Well, I mean, this property was your absolutely typical Southeastern property that, fire wasn't a thing. It was kind of a hands-off approach. There was a lot of planted pine in some of it that had never been thinned. And it was probably, 15, 20 years old. It was ready for its first thinning. There was some stuff that had been thinned and it was a little older, about 30-year-old loblolly. Most all of this area is loblolly. There are some little longleaf tracks in there, but it was just really thick. A lot of yaupon in some of this area. Yaupon's really bad in these sandy soils and in East Texas, Southeast Texas, where we're working. But the first step was they had burned some of this stuff before getting in there and doing some thinning. But the first step was thinning and getting that overstory right. And you can go different. I've heard different, processes or the order of these different things. So don't think that you have to go in this order or anything. But for our case, we said, okay, this pine stand, typically you're going to do maybe every third or every fourth row thinning and open it up a little bit. And that's going to take 15, 20 years. But the landowner we were working with said, I don't have 20 years to wait. Let's be a little more aggressive and get it on a little quicker. So they actually went in every other row thinning and then in between rows and really opened it up because they didn't want to wait 15 or 20 years, and I think there's a lot of landowners in the Southeast today that are in their 60s or 70s that they don't have a 20-year rotation to see their pine plantation turn into a beautiful mature forest. It takes time. That's intergenerational work. But yeah, that was the first area that they started was getting a good logging crew in and getting a good forester, marking trees and opening it up and starting a burn plan and figuring out what was going to be burned. For the yaupon, we had to do a little bit of mechanical work with either mulchers and or brown tree cutters. And then fire has been namely the other tool. Hasn't been a whole bunch of chemical application as a matter of fact. We haven't had to use any chemical yet, but we're still early in that restoration phase, 4 or 5 years in, but that might be needed at some point. But yeah, really it was getting in there with the saw head and drip torch were the first two things.
I really liked hearing from Brad and the perspective he has from actually putting boots on the ground, taking a property that is essentially no good for quail and going through the process of transforming it into quail habitat and then seeing the results. in a way, it kind of doubles down on what we've been saying all along. No matter how bleak it may be in some areas, there is still hope. And like I said, I'm holding on to that. To round this episode out, I could not think of a better person to talk to than Olivia Lappin. After all, this whole episode is centered on the present and future of quail right here in the Southeast. And for there to be a present and future, there has to be dedicated and passionate people that are in the right roles. If you happen to catch it in episode 1 and 2, Olivia's name was referenced a couple times. She was the person who was out doing extensive and tedious, long-houred research at Prairie Wildlife. Olivia is now the rights-of-way and energy coordinating wildlife biologist and the Southeast seed representative for Quail Forever. Olivia, along with her passion and knowledge, has a lot to offer to quail populations, and I'm here to see what she has to say. Talking about having any sort of needle-moving restoration for quail down in the Southeast. You know, these public land projects that you see, they're great. They're absolutely great for sure. But he was saying if we're going to see any sort of real result that we can measure, it's going to have to take place on private land simply because of the amount of land that is privatized.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the numbers are probably different now, but I think it's about 72% of 2.27 billion acres in the U.S. is non-federal rural land, which is like an insane amount of land that is going to have, that really puts the fate of bobwhite in the hands of private landowners. Absolutely. And, we have great organizations, great state agencies working to help bobwhite, but so much of that really does fall on the landowner because one, just habitat connectivity. You might have one landowner that's doing great. Mr. Jimmy, he was talking about all the work that he does, and that's where I did my research. But you go outside, Mr. Jimmy's property, and there's nothing there. So all the birds are just kind of concentrated right there. You might have a couple that kind of emigrate out of the population, but if your neighbors aren't doing it, then you can do all that you can. But you really need to kind of have those just multiple people working together to really help make a difference. And state agencies do great, but that's only such a small percentage of land out there for them. Right.
Going back, you mentioned something in there. You mentioned the research you did at Prairie Wildlife. One of the reasons that I felt like I just had to get you on here to part of this podcast because the list of people that were on this so far, there was Jimmy Bryan, of course, Andy Edwards, Mark Mcconnell, John Mark Curtis, and in this final installment of this series, we're more or less talking about kind of where we're at right now. And then what could we, no one knows for sure, but what could we possibly see in the future? And when I was talking to all those people, your name came up several times. They talked about you, and then they talked about the research that you were doing out at Prairie Wildlife. So what were you working on when you were out there?
Yeah, so I had two different research projects out there. It's funny, bobwhite quail are probably one of the most studied game species out there, yet we still don't know everything about them. So we had two different projects going on. One was looking at their calling behavior, simply because that's how we do population surveys for quail. Covey counts, spring, breeding season counts, or roadside surveys. Usually we're using that vocalization to count how many there are. The problem is we really don't have a good way of counting them. I think it's pretty similar for turkeys. Like you can kind of get an estimate and you can do all these like math calculations to try to account for the fact that we don't know exactly how many are out there. But the problem is quail are incredibly tricky species, management wise in every other way. And so they are so frustrating because they should be calling, a nice sunny morning, you go out there, blue skies, they should be singing. During the breeding season, and you go out and it's just dead silent. And so you're not counting these birds that should be there. And so you're just constantly not really getting these accurate population counts. So we were basically looking at what factors affect whether or not they call during the breeding season, temperature, cloud cover, all those typical environmental variables. But then also our main thing was looking at if the presence of other males around one of our radio collared birds, if there's other males singing around them, are they going to be more likely to sing? Just because there's other animals singing around them, that will trigger them to start singing too. And so, Prairie Wildlife not having a crazy high density of bobwhite, if there's one bird and there's no other birds singing around it, is it less likely to sing? Just because what's the point? You're just giving yourself away to predators. You're probably already kind of near a female. What's the point of singing? So then we're not able to count it. And we did end up finding that birds were a lot less likely to sing when there weren't as many other males singing around them. So a place like prairie wildlife where it's low density, you might be underestimating your population simply because there's just not as many birds out there singing, and they're not singing. So basically bringing up the fact that when you're trying to monitor a population, you have to go out multiple times to really accurately try to get a good count on those birds. You can't just go out to one site one time, not hear a bird, and say there's nothing there. It really takes more monitoring than that. And then the second part was basically just looking at roost site selection during the breeding season. So where the birds are roosting in, what kind of vegetation they like, and so forth, just so we can give that information to land managers. So they know, what kind of vegetation to manage for. And we ended up finding that they like kind of shorter vegetation, not really thick vegetation. So again, prescribed burning, disking, all that stuff that we already know for quail is helpful for them roosting as well. But really just trying to create that mosaic type landscape where, if you wanted to do an early spring burn, that's great. That'll bring really great arthropod abundance and insects and so forth. But that also is getting rid of all that vegetation structure that they'd want to roost in. So you can't just burn off a whole field and think that you're doing great. You got to kind of make a patchwork of different vegetation types. So.
Yeah. Well, that's synonymous with, and this was, I don't know, a year or two ago, I was talking to Dr. Marcus Lashley, and we were more so talking about turkeys than we were quail, but he brought up quail in the conversation because he said, he was like, the amount of people that we see, or the uptick we see in people prescribe burning on their property now is great because he's seen an increase. He's like, but what we got to try to get them to do now is essentially what you're saying, not just do one burn in the early spring and be like, yes, we did it, but kind of more or less have some sort of rotation throughout the year. I tell you one thing, I've picked up on all these similarities talking to you and everyone else that I've had on this series. And I say this, being a fan of whatever kind of quail restoration we can have, but it's like everything that y'all have to do, be it management or research or whatever that is, it seems so intensive. Like none of it sounds easy, so to speak.
Yep. Yeah. And so when you were talking about, the future of bobwhite quail populations, that is always on top of my mind as one of the things that scares me the most, is that they're not an easy species to manage for. I mean, they're expensive to manage for. It takes time. It takes effort, especially now, in the Southeast, we've got invasive species we have to deal with. You've got to do fires, and fire in itself. I mean, we're doing a great job, like you said, of getting more people comfortable doing prescribed fires. But it's a learning curve, and my biggest worry about it is, the people who are out there doing land management right now, a lot of them are older generations. Mr. Jimmy, he has a connection to these birds. He grew up with them. He grew up hunting them. There's that connection there. He's seen them. But what about the people who have probably never heard of bobwhite or haven't frequently or have never seen one? How do we get them to really care about wanting to manage their property, which is an extensive management, for a bird that they've probably never seen or heard? How do we grow that passion? We can do outreach and education till we're blue in the face, which is great, and we absolutely should keep doing it. But like getting that deep rooted connection that people like Mr. Jimmy and some other landowners have because of their past and stories hunting with them, how do we develop that now for people my age, for our generations? How do we get people to care about these birds? That's something I'm really passionate about. That I don't have the answer. I don't know.
Yeah, it's not. It's like I wanted to. By the time I got to the end of this, I wanted like this final episode to be this big uplifting thing and be like this is the answer we got. But it's just not that simple. It's not doom and gloom. Like there's hope. I definitely think there's hope. There's the term that I learned from Mark Mcconnell, the cautiously optimistic. And I like that. But like what you said, so, this whole thing for me, there's a connection for me, but it's an entire generation back. And so I'm 31, you talk to the hunters coming up now that are in their teens and 20s. How do they connect to a quail? That where it's not really available. That's that's the question. Because going back to what we were talking about, the landowners, the private land, that's where this is gonna have to come from. And it's unfortunately there's no like easy answer as much as I would like there to be.
Yeah, absolutely. It would be nice if there was a single easy answer for bobwhite quail, but they do not make it easy. But yeah, I definitely agree. How do we get them interested in it, but then also stay interested in it, which, wildlife conservation itself is like, there can be all this glitz and glam around saving a species. Like, I don't know, you probably remember when it was a whole save the polar bear thing, save the polar bears and whatever. And then we don't have a connection with polar bears. So for a little bit, it's cool. But then I've never seen a polar bear. I don't know anything about them. So now I don't think about them because I just don't have any sort of connection with them to really continue to care. I mean, I care, but there's nothing I can do about it.
Right.
I mean, it's kind of that mindset for people for bobwhite. It's like, well, I mean, they used to be here and now they're just gone. A lot of people don't even think they exist anymore. So and that outreach and education is huge. But yeah, just how do we inspire people to care is tough. And I mean, I didn't know what a bobwhite quail was 4 years ago, whenever I started my master's degree. I'm from Maine. I'm not from the Southeast, didn't grow up from a hunting family, had never seen a bobwhite. Honestly, never heard of bobwhite, nothing. And to be quite honest, and Mark Mcconnell probably doesn't want to hear this, is I didn't even think I was really going to get into bobwhite quail when I started my research. I was like, I'm just going to get my master's degree, because I have to be a biologist. And then I swear, like the first time I held a bobwhite, and most people, their stories with bobwhite and their connection to it is through hunting, but mine was just holding a bobwhite, capturing it and putting a collar on it. I was like, these are the cutest birds I've ever seen in my entire life. And I just, and just kind of learning the personalities of each bird because we had them radio collared. I mean, that really grew my passion for them, but that's not an everyday person. So if I didn't have that experience, I mean, I wouldn't, I'd never have that connection with bobwhite. And I mean, they're the ones, bobwhite are what got me interested in hunting and everything. So I think it really comes down to just trying to be creative in the ways that we try to get people connected to these birds and all wildlife in general. We can count on the hunter to do good, but how do we get other people? Hunters are the easiest way to get people interested in helping bobwhite, turkeys, and so forth, because that connection is there. But if we really want to target all landowners, there's a lot that aren't hunters. How do we get them to be inspired about bobwhite? And, I'm thinking David, a couple months ago, had posted that video of the bobwhite quail singing. And gosh, I looked at the comments one day, and like David doesn't get like tons of comments on his things, but this one bobwhite quail video, so many people commented on it, having these connections, whether it was their grandfather or they went hunting with their father. It was so fun to read through those. And I mean, one of my favorite ones was a woman said that she uses the bobwhite whistle to find her kids in the grocery store when they're lost. And it's like a family tradition that they do now. And so like, it's there. I mean, I was so pleasantly shocked to see how many people commented on that, caring about bobwhite. So it's there. It's just, how do we foster that into actual change and management for them? So,
yeah. Well, so, I mean, obviously, and again, I tend to be an optimist anyway, but like, obviously you and several other people think that there is hope, there is potential there. I mean, if you didn't, you wouldn't be in the career you're in right now, because this is what you spend the majority of your time doing is, so it's like I said, there's no easy answer there. It's not going to sit here and say there's going to be some easy path, but there is a path, I think, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing is too, is I think a lot of people think that you have to have acres and acres of land to make a difference. And you don't. Like I was saying, part of my job that I love the most is talking to landowners on the phone when they're telling me about some little habitat project that they're working on and they need some native seed for. And they'll talk to me for like a half hour to an hour, just talking about, their story with bobwhite quail or whatever. Sometimes it's turkey or ducks. And I mean, half of the sales I'm doing are like an acre to an acre. But that's where it starts. Like you can do a little bit and then you're going to get hooked. And that's the thing is I feel like you start it and you see the change that even a little bit can have. And then I think that kind of just grows and grows more. So, I mean, we've seen with like government programs like CP33, those little buffers that you can put around, like habitat buffers around crop fields. And there's tons of research showing that little buffer can significantly increase your bobwhite population. Sure. So who says if you transform, a half acre on your property to native grasses and forbs, that's not going to make a significant difference, especially if your neighbors have quail. You don't need to have acres and acres to make a change. You can, start small. Every little bit really does make a difference.
Well, it's thinking, so Mark was telling me that, like take prairie wildlife, for example. He's like, he said that approximately like 25% of those birds are going to move somewhere, and it's like, think about if you could just start some sort of grid work, be it small, just around prairie wildlife, and it would be a slow process, obviously, but kind of like what you're saying, like if those birds are trying to disperse to some degree, if you could just get a little bit nearby prairie wildlife, then you would kind of start to have a little bit of an expansion. It'd be micro, it'd be on a county level probably, but it would be something.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny you say that. So David and I were sitting on his parents' porch one day, and we're just sitting there, and I'm like, I swear I just heard a bobwhite whistle. We're in an area, we're like, or you probably know where the Light Boots property is. It's like right there, not in a place where bobwhite really should be. There's nothing for them there. It's more right in town. And we're just sitting there, and I was like, I swear I heard a bobwhite, but I think I'm just going crazy because I hear them. That's all I do is listen to bobwhite all day, every day. And then we heard it again. And so part of my research was, playing female calls to try to entice birds to fly through nets and stuff. So I played a female call just to see if we could see where the bird was hanging out. And it just flew right in, right next to the porch. And his parents had never seen a bobwhite, at least I don't think, or they haven't for years. And they were so excited, and we all had the binoculars out. We're looking at this bobwhite. And so, even that, they do disperse. Like, that bird should not have been in that area, but it was. So, when we move back down, we're going to try to make his property into more native forbs, cut some trees down, open it up, and, make it our own little project, because why not,
Yeah.
They're both there. They want to be there. So let's try to help them be there. So
give them somewhere to live that's where, that's decent habitat for them.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely.
How many, if you had to guess, like how many hours do you think you spent doing research at prairie wildlife?
Oh, jeez.
They were telling, I heard
40-hour work week. Yeah. And it's not just like that, the field work, I was out in the field all the time, and my technicians were amazing. They really took a lot off my plate. I didn't have to be in the field every day because I had amazing technicians that would go out, track the birds for me and all that. So, but trapping wise, we trapped birds every night. So we had to check traps every night, which took anywhere from, 2 to 3 or more hours. We did it all weather conditions. We were out there all the time. But they really helped, in the field work stuff so that I could do all the actual data entry, and I say the boring stuff, so that they could be out there collecting data, and I'm the one, analyzing it and writing about it. So,
right.
But it was a lot. But it's funny, at the time I was like, this is never going to end. And now I kind of wish back I was doing it again. It's really fun. So
what do you think 10 years from now, 20 years from now, what do you think quail could look like down here in the Southeast, numbers wise?
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely think that we can change their population trajectory to be increasing. They've been decreasing for years, but I honestly think that through land management, through more education, through more just interest in doing land management, which we've already seen increasing. We were talking about prescribed fire. We've already seen more and more people being interested in managing land the way that it should be, just to be better. We've seen people already taking land, like crop land, out of production. That's not super productive land, out of production, throwing it into a conservation program, whether it be through government programs or state agency programs. We've already seen that happening. We just have to see it even more. We got to get more and more people interested in this. And then I absolutely think that we'll see bobwhite populations increase. And I'm sure you've heard it from probably every other person on this podcast, the whole, if you build it, they will come.
Oh yeah.
It's absolutely true. So I definitely, I'm an optimist that if we can get more people passionate about it, I absolutely think that their populations will respond. There's so many programs out there, there's money there. We want to help it. There's money, there's training, we've got farm bill biologists through Quail Forever out there to help you. We've got burn associations in different states. Like, there's people there to help. You just got to reach out and we'll be there. Somebody's got to have the interest in it. and just reach out to somebody, and we'll be there, and we'll help you with whatever you need to manage your habitat the way that you want.
I really liked listening to Olivia's perspective. It was refreshing. It was encouraging. It's realistic in how it acknowledges the challenges, but it still holds on to a very real possibility that we could bring about a positive change in quail populations, and in turn, restore a style of hunting that was once a staple to this entire region. I mean, really, how cool would that be? Think about it. Before we wrap this up, I can't help but think about some of the key takeaways I've gotten from all of this. It's taught me, truly, to not take a single game species for granted. It's also given me an even deeper appreciation for conservation efforts, researchers, and people that dedicate their lives to preserve wild places and wild animals, and in turn, they preserve our way of life. And honestly, it's motivated me to really look around and see what I can actually do to take better care of the land and the wildlife around me. Well, my friends, we have officially reached the end. But this series is not mine to wrap up. To officially sign us off, we're going back to where this all started, with some final thoughts from Andy Edwards of Quail Forever and Mr. Jimmy Bryan.
We know that we can't bring quail back at a regional scale, honestly, at a statewide scale. But we can bring quail back in certain areas to sustainable populations that are going to be around for generations. But we have to do that with a focused effort. So we're doing that with chapters, we're doing that with people, we're doing that with projects on the ground, land acquisitions, those sorts of things, where we're putting our focus right on the areas where we're going to have success for quail.
We didn't do anything deliberate for quail. God just gave them to us. But it's a long, hard battle, and we'll never get back to, it'll never be the same. I won't live long enough to do all the things I want to do, but if you don't have something you want to do, why do you need to be here?